I wasn't late to my wedding. I was replaced. And the worst part? Everyone in that room already knew. Everyone, except me. The California coastline stretched endlessly behind the estate. Waves crashed softly beneath a sky painted in gold and amber, the kind of sky that made everything feel sacred, feel permanent. Everything about this wedding was perfect, designed, curated, controlled. Zariah Cole stood just minutes away from walking into the life she had spent years quietly, carefully building. Her dress fit like it was made for her, because it was. Her future felt certain, because she had worked for it. Marcus Cole had shaken hands with the Whitmores that morning, pride visible in every line of his face. Denise Cole had adjusted every detail twice, then once more for perfection. This wasn't just a wedding. This was a union of families, of influence, of legacy. And Zariah had believed, truly believed, that she was the center of it. But 10 minutes before the ceremony, everything shifted. Her phone went dead. The coordinator smiled too carefully and asked her to wait. Her bridesmaids disappeared, one by one, each with an excuse that felt rehearsed, practiced. And when Zariah finally stepped through those doors, the music had already started, the guests were already standing. Ethan Whitmore was already at the altar, and beside him, wearing her dress, wearing her veil, standing in her place, was Liana Cole, her little sister, smiling. Before we go 1 second further, my husband just walked into this room and made me a deal I could not ignore. He said if this story gets us to 10,000 subscribers, he will get me the car I have always wanted, the one I have been dreaming about for years. So if you have ever loved a story on this channel, right now is the moment. Hit subscribe, tell a friend, leave a comment. Because Zariah needs justice and I need that car. Now let's go. The Whitmore estate was not the kind of place you simply arrived at. You were received by it. The iron gates opened onto a private coastal road lined with imported olive trees. The main house, white stone and glass, sat at the edge of a cliff above the Pacific, commanding the horizon like it had always owned it. For the Whitmore family, it had. 3 generations of accumulated power, real estate, private equity, political influence quite enough to be dangerous. Zariah had spent 8 months learning the rhythm of this world, the correct way to greet Victoria Whitmore, the topics Richard Whitmore preferred at dinner, the careful balance between confidence and deference that Ethan seemed to need from her, though she had never quite named it that until now. She had told herself it was love. She was good at telling herself things. That morning, Denise Cole had dressed her with practiced hands, smoothing the lace at her shoulders, adjusting the veil with precise fingers. "You look beautiful," she had said. Not, "I am proud of you." Not, "I love you, Zariah." Just, "You look beautiful." Like a product, inspected and approved. Zariah had smiled anyway. She sat alone in the bridal suite for 40 minutes after that, watching the clock, listening to the faint sound of the string quartet warming up beyond the garden walls. The coordinator knocked at 30 minutes out. "Everything is moving beautifully, Miss Cole. Just a few more minutes." Not, "Your wedding." Just, "Everything." Zariah noticed, filed it away, told herself she was overthinking. At 20 minutes, she tried Ethan's number. No signal. She moved to the window. Below, guests in ivory and champagne filled the white chairs in perfect rows. She could see the floral arch at the altar, ivory roses and trailing greenery, exactly as she had chosen. She could see her father. Marcus Cole stood near the garden entrance, shaking hands with Richard Whitmore, both of them laughing. Relaxed. Satisfied. Zariah pressed her palm flat against the glass. The ceremony wasn't running behind, she just wasn't in it. The door had been locked for 40 minutes, her phone was dead, and her father was laughing like a man who had already gotten everything he came for. It was the silence that finally broke through. Not the absence of sound, but the specific, deliberate silence of people who had been told to stay away. Zariah moved back to the door, tried it, still locked. She knocked, firm, controlled. No one answered. She crossed to the opposite wall and tried the secondary door. A narrow passage the coordinator had mentioned led to the dressing corridor. It opened, and there, sitting on the vanity shelf inside that corridor, was a bouquet. Not hers. Hers was white garden roses and eucalyptus, wrapped in ivory ribbon, still sitting on the table behind her. This one was different. White roses, but with dark burgundy ranunculus threaded through. Richer, bolder, deliberate. Someone else's choice. Zariah stood very still. Her mind moved slowly at first, and then all at once. She thought about the bridesmaids, the coordinator, the locked door, the dead phone, her father's laughter. She picked up the second bouquet, turned it over in her hands. A small card was tucked into the ribbon. For the bride. No name. Zariah set it down carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you refuse to let them. She walked back through the primary suite, straight to the main door and turned the handle. This time it opened. No one was standing outside. No coordinator, no bridesmaid, no guard. Because they no longer needed to keep her in. They just needed her to arrive too late to stop it. She stepped into the corridor and heard it, the processional music, already playing. She didn't run. She walked. Because some part of her already knew, and that part needed a moment longer before the knowing became real. The ceremony garden was filled with 200 people. No one saw her come in. Every head was turned forward, toward the altar, toward the music, toward the moment unfolding at the front of the garden like a painting arranged for their viewing. Zariah moved along the far edge of the seating, slowly, steadily, one hand trailing the stone wall beside her. She could see the altar from here, the ivory rose arch, the candles, the officiant in his dark suit, book open, voice carrying softly over the sound of the ocean beyond. She could see Ethan, standing straight, composed, handsome in the way that photographs well and feels slightly distant in person. And beside him, the bride. Zariah saw the dress first, her dress, the lace overlay, the cathedral train she had spent 3 appointments selecting, the way it caught the coastal light exactly as she had imagined. Then the veil. Then the posture, shoulders back, chin lifted, one hand holding a bouquet of white roses and dark burgundy ranunculus. Zariah stopped walking. The bride turned her head slightly, just enough. A profile, a jawline, a familiar curve of cheek and brow that Zariah had known her entire life. Liana. The officiant's voice continued, warm and unhurried. To have and to hold, from this day forward. Zariah took one step forward, and Ethan looked up, directly at her. His eyes found hers across the garden, clear, steady, certain. And then, he looked away, on purpose, back to Liana, back to the ceremony, back to the life he had clearly already chosen, like Zariah was a guest who had wandered into the wrong event, like she was no one. He saw her, he recognized her, and he chose, in that single, quiet moment, to continue anyway. That was the moment Zariah stopped grieving and started watching. She didn't scream. She had always been the kind of woman who went still when the world went wrong, not because she was weak, but because stillness was how she survived it. She stood at the edge of the garden and watched, and then a hand closed around her arm, firm, familiar. Marcus Cole materialized from the shadow of the garden archway, appearing the way he always did, exactly when it served him. Zariah. His voice was low, controlled. Don't. Just that. Don't. Not, I'm sorry, not, let me explain, just, don't make this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the careful neutrality in his expression, the practiced calm of a man who had already processed his guilt and filed it somewhere it would never inconvenience him again. When? She asked quietly. He said nothing. When did you decide? Before he could answer, Richard Whitmore glanced back from the front row, found Marcus's eyes, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Approval. Confirmation. Well done. Zariah watched her father receive it like a reward. She turned to find her mother. Denise Cole was seated in the front family row, back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed forward, not watching the ceremony, watching nothing, because looking at Zariah would have required her to feel something she had already decided not to feel. And then, from the row behind Richard Whitmore, she heard it, a whisper, quiet but close enough. Richard leaning toward his wife Victoria. "The right one is at the altar now." Victoria's response, a small, satisfied exhale, like a correction had finally been made, like Zariah had been a problem that had now been solved. She had thought this was a last-minute betrayal, a panic decision, a cruel accident. But Richard Whitmore did not exhale like a man who had made a rushed choice. He exhaled like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. This was always the plan. She was never the bride. She was the placeholder. I need you to stay with me right now, because what happens next changes everything. If you're not subscribed yet, please do it now. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world. Now let's keep going, because Zariah is about to make a decision that nobody in that garden is ready for. Liana glanced back, just once, found Zariah's eyes across the garden, and mouthed 2 words, slowly, carefully. "I'm sorry." But her feet didn't move. Marcus pulled her into the side corridor before she could speak. The sound of the ceremony faded behind the stone wall, muffled, distant, continuing without her. He stood with his back to the garden entrance, arms at his sides, voice deliberately measured. "The Whitmores approached me 4 months ago," he said. "They felt that Liana was a better fit for what the family needed long-term." Zariah stared at him. "Better fit," she repeated. "Younger, more adaptable, easier to..." He paused, chose the word carefully. "Integrate." "Easier to control," Zariah said. "Say what you mean, Marcus." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "The alliance with the Whitmores is worth more than your daughter." Silence. He didn't fill it. And that silence, that deliberate, chosen silence, told her everything his words had been carefully avoiding. She heard footsteps behind her, turned. Denise Cole stood at the corridor entrance, hands clasped in front of her, eyes finally meeting Zariah's for the first time all day. "You were always too strong for them," she said quietly. "Too certain of yourself. Too..." She stopped, searched for the word. "Present." She said it like an apology, like she had spent years watching Zariah be exactly herself and had decided, somewhere along the way, that it was a liability. That's not a compliment in their world, baby. And there it was, the most honest thing Denise Cole had ever said to her daughter, offered as justification, landing as devastation. Zariah felt something move through her, not tears, not rage, something quieter than both, colder, more permanent, the specific grief of understanding that the people who were supposed to protect you had been cataloging your strengths as problems to be managed. She opened her mouth to respond, and stopped, because there was someone else in the corridor, standing in the shadow near the far wall, still, watching. A man neither Marcus nor Denise had noticed, a man who had clearly been there long enough to hear everything. He didn't move when she saw him. He didn't look away either. He just watched her, with the quiet attention of someone who already knew exactly what kind of room he had walked into. Marcus saw him a second later and went rigid. Denise turned, and for the first time that day, her composure cracked, just slightly. The man stepped forward into the light, unhurried, deliberate, and Marcus immediately shifted his body in front of Zariah in a reflex that had nothing to do with protecting her. It had everything to do with protecting himself. "Mr. Kang," Marcus said carefully, "this is a private family matter." "I know," the man said simply. He wasn't looking at Marcus, he was looking at Zariah. And then Marcus made a quiet sound, something between a warning and a dismissal, and took Denise by the arm, steering them both back toward the garden, leaving Zariah alone in the corridor, with him. She didn't feel afraid. That surprised her. She felt watched. Not in the way that made her want to disappear, in the way that made her feel visible for the first time since she had arrived at this estate. She turned away from him and walked to the narrow window at the corridor's end, looked out at the ceremony still unfolding below, Liana at the altar, Ethan composed and still, 200 guests witnessing a wedding built on a decision that had never included her. She had spent 8 months preparing to belong to a world that had already decided she didn't fit, not because she had failed, because she had refused, without even knowing it, to make herself smaller, and they had found someone who would. She reached up, slowly, and removed the veil still pinned in her hair, folded it once, set it on the window ledge. She wasn't getting married today. She wasn't getting married here. Not to a man who had looked at her across a garden and looked away. Not into a family that had chosen her sister because she was easier to manage. Not for parents who had translated her strength into inconvenience. She straightened, turned back to the corridor. The man was still there, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, but it wasn't pity. It was closer to recognition. "You heard everything," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. "Who are you?" He reached into his jacket, produced a card, and held it out. She didn't take it yet. "Answer the question," she said. A pause, and then something close to the edge of a smile. "Someone who has a problem with this wedding," he said. "And I think, so do you." She looked at the card, then at him, and for the first time all day, she felt the balance of power shift. Not toward the Whitmores, not toward her family, toward her. His name was Kang Dae-hyun. She learned that first from the card, clean, heavy stock, nothing on it except his name and a number. No title, no company, no explanation. Men who needed titles, she would learn, were men who needed to be believed. He didn't need either. "You're not a wedding guest," she said. "No." "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't hesitation. It was selection, choosing exactly what to say and what to leave for later. "The Whitmore family has a business arrangement that requires my agreement to finalize," he said. "The signing was scheduled for tonight, after the ceremony." "What kind of arrangement?" "The kind built on documents I did not draft and signatures I did not give." Zariah went still. "They forged your signature?" "They forged several," he said. He let that land, watched her face as it did. "Including," he continued, "the identity authorization on the property transfer at the center of the deal. An authorization that was filed under your name, Miss Cole, signed 18 months ago." The air in the corridor thinned. "I never signed anything for the Whitmores." "I know," he said. "I've known for 6 weeks. I've been waiting to understand the full scope of what they built before I moved." She stared at him. "You came here to let them think it was going forward." "I came here," he said, "to end it in the right room, in front of the right people, with no room left for them to rewrite the story afterward." And then, quietly, he said something else. "I also came because I recognized your name on those documents. I remembered where I had seen it before." She frowned. "We've never met." "No, but 14 months ago you testified in a federal contractor fraud case, publicly, against a man with significant connections." A pause. "That man also had connections to my operations. Your testimony cost him everything, and protected something I would have lost quietly." She remembered the case. She remembered the threats that came after it. She had testified anyway. "You never forgot," she said slowly. "I don't forget people with that kind of courage," he said simply. "Especially not when I find their name forged on a criminal document." He straightened, adjusted the cuff of his jacket with a precise, unhurried motion. "I'm going back into that garden now," he said. "What happens in the next 5 minutes will determine what the Whitmore family looks like for the next 20 years. He moved toward the corridor door, then paused.
Whether you come is your choice, but I think you've earned the right to be in that room when the truth arrives.
He walked toward the garden, and Zariah, for the first time in 8 months, moved towards something not because she was supposed to, but because she chose to. The officiant was 3 sentences from the vows when Kang Dae-hyun walked back into the garden. He didn't rush. He walked the center aisle at the pace of a man who owned the room he was entering, and every head turned before he was halfway down it, pulled by something instinctive, something that recognized, without being told, that this man did not arrive anywhere without intention. The music stopped. The officiant looked up. Ethan Whitmore turned, and for the first time that afternoon, something moved behind his composed expression, something close to fear. Richard Whitmore rose from the front row.
Mr. Kang, this is not the appropriate. Sit down, Richard.
2 words, quiet as stone dropping into still water. Richard sat. Kang stopped at the foot of the altar and turned, not to Ethan, not to Liana, not to the stunned audience arranged in their perfect white chairs. He turned to Richard Whitmore, and he addressed him the way you address someone whose time has run out.
The property acquisition filed under the Whitmore-Cole Joint Trust, he said,
voice carrying clearly over the silence,
was built on 3 forged identity authorizations, one of which belonged to me, one of which belonged to a woman who was never told her name was on the document.
Murmuring moved through the guests. Richard's jaw tightened.
These are accusations these are facts, Kang said. I have the original filings, I have the forensic authentication, and I have, in the car outside, a federal contact who has been waiting for me to confirm today's attendance before proceeding.
Complete silence. Victoria Whitmore reached for her husband's arm. Ethan looked at Liana. Liana looked at her hands.
This wedding, Kang said, is the final step in a fraud that has been 18 months in construction. The moment these vows complete, the trust activates and the transfer processes, which is why it ends here.
He reached into his jacket and placed a document on the altar ledge, in front of the officiant, in front of everyone.
My withdrawal from the agreement, effective immediately,
witnessed by 200 people. Richard Whitmore stood again, face darkening.
You will not walk away from this deal.
I already have. And then Kang turned, toward the back of the garden, toward Zariah, who had walked in quietly while every eye was on him, standing at the garden entrance. Veil gone, head up, present. The woman whose name was used without her knowledge or consent, he said to the room, to the witnesses, to the record of it, is standing at the back of this garden. She came to this estate today to be married. Instead, she was replaced, locked in a room, and forged on a criminal document. Not a single person moved. Marcus Cole stared at his daughter from across the garden, and for the first time in her memory, he looked small. This wedding is over, Kang said, and so is your agreement with me. Marcus stepped forward, opened his mouth, and Kang Dae-hyun looked at him with an expression so quiet, so absolute, that the words died before they arrived.
Sit down, Mr. Cole, he said. Your daughter is no longer your business.
The garden was silent in the way that only shock produces, not the silence of peace, the silence of 200 people recalibrating everything they thought they understood about the afternoon they had just witnessed. Zariah walked forward, not quickly, not with performance or theatrics. She walked the way a woman walks when she has made a decision that nothing in the world will reverse, steady, unhurried, certain. Every eye followed her. She passed the rows of guests who had come to watch her be replaced without knowing it, past the floral arrangements she had chosen for a wedding that was never truly hers, past her mother, who sat rigid in the front row, hands folded tight in her lap, eyes following her daughter with an expression that was finally, unmistakably grief. Not for the wedding, for the years, for every moment she had chosen the comfortable thing over the true thing,
and was now watching the cost of it walk past her in a cathedral dress with no veil and no apology. Zariah reached the altar. She looked at Liana. Liana, still holding her bouquet, eyes glassy, composure finally cracking at its edges, reached out one hand. Zariah. Zariah stopped, looked at her sister, really looked at her, at the girl who had grown up in the same house, learned from the same parents, understood the same silent rules about whose comfort mattered most. She didn't feel rage. She felt something older than that, something that had already finished. I hope it was worth it, she said quietly, not as a curse, as a goodbye. Liana's hand dropped. Zariah turned from the altar, and Kam Dae-hyun was standing at the edge of the aisle, waiting. Not hovering, not commanding, waiting. He extended his hand, not as possession, not as rescue, as an offer between two people who had both just walked away from the same table. She looked at it, then at him. I want full transparency on those documents, she said. Every page. You'll have them tonight, he said. And I make my own decisions. I wouldn't have it otherwise. She took his hand. Behind her, she heard Marcus call her name, once, sharp, the way he had called it her entire life when he needed her to fall back into line. She didn't turn around. She walked out of the garden with the California sun on her face and the sound of the ocean below, the same ocean that had framed the perfect wedding she was supposed to have, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, like herself, fully, finally, dangerously. Zariah Cole didn't lose her wedding. She lost the illusion that she ever needed one, and the woman who walked out of that garden was no one's placeholder, no one's second choice, no one's silence, ever again. That was Zariah. That was her moment, and I need you to know, stories like this one only keep coming because of you. If this moved you, if you felt every single chapter, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe if you haven't, and drop in the comments, was Liana wrong? Was Denise redeemable? I read every single one. Thank you for being here. This is Christie J Story, and we are just getting started.